While an entire town shivered in the dark, their propane turned to useless slush as they prayed for a rescue that wasn't coming. One man sat comfortably in a t-shirt, reading by firelight. They had called him crazy for building a 6-ton rock heater before raising a roof. Now, with the temperature dropping so fast, it shattered the thermometer at 40 below. Nobody was laughing. The town of Oak Ridge, nestled high in the unforgiving jagged peaks of the Pacific Northwest, was a place where people prided themselves on their rugged independence. They drove heavy-duty trucks, stockpiled cordwood, and possessed the kind of arrogance that comes from taming a wild landscape with modern technology. When Arturo Pendleton arrived in late April, he didn't look like a mountain man. At 62, he was wiry, spectacled, and carried the quiet, methodical demeanor of a retired structural engineer, which he was. Arturo had purchased a 5-acre lot on the exposed, wind-battered eastern slope of Miller's Ridge. It was the cheapest land in the county, for a reason. It caught the brunt of every winter gale coming down from the Canadian border. When construction began, the locals expected a standard timber frame build, heavily insulated, maybe with a backup diesel generator. That was the Oak Ridge way. Instead, the first thing Arturo had delivered to his barren dirt lot was not lumber, but flatbed trucks groaning under the weight of raw, dense stone. 12,000 pounds of basalt, refractory fire brick, and massive slabs of imported soapstone. Greg Miller, the town's premier contractor, and a man whose voice was always just a decibel too loud, parked his F-250 by the property line one Tuesday to watch. He leaned against the hood, spitting sunflower seeds into the dirt. "You building a fortress or a mausoleum, old man?" Greg called out, chuckling as Arturo meticulously leveled a massive concrete footing, far thicker than any standard foundation required. Arturo barely looked up from his transit level. "Neither. I'm building a battery," Greg snorted, shaking his head. "Well, when you get tired of playing with rocks and want a real house built that won't freeze your toes off by November, you call my office." But Arturo didn't call. For the next 2 months, while the spring flowers bloomed, Arturo built an absolute monstrosity in the center of his property. It was a massive, monolithic masonry heater, a specialized ancient design known in Eastern Europe as a Russian stove or a Finnish contraflow heater. But this was an extreme version. It stood 8 feet tall, 6 feet wide, and was engineered with a complex internal labyrinth of baffles. The town watched in bewildered amusement. Every morning at the local diner, Wanda's Cafe, Arturo became the main event for gossip. "I drove by yesterday," Dave Hodges, the hardware store owner, told a table of nodding locals over black coffee. "He hasn't put up a single wall, no framing, no plumbing. Just this giant, ugly stone chimney sitting in the middle of a dirt field. Looks like an altar for some crazy cult." I asked him where his furnace was going. Sarah Jenkins, the town clerk, chimed in. "He just patted that giant rock and said, 'Right here.' I told him it gets to -10 up here in January. He just smiled at me. The man is going to freeze to death before Christmas." What Oak Ridge didn't understand was Arturo's obsession with thermal mass and his deep distrust of fragile grids. Years ago, during a massive ice storm in the Midwest, Arturo had watched modern, expensive homes become death traps within 24 hours of a power grid failure. Generators ran out of fuel, pipes burst, people froze in their beds, surrounded by thousands of dollars of useless electronics. Arturo had spent his career calculating load-bearing thresholds and structural failures. He viewed the modern housing infrastructure as a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. His masonry heater was designed to defy that failure. By burning a small, fiercely hot fire for just 2 hours, the exhaust gases would snake through the internal stone baffles, transferring heat into the 6 tons of dense soapstone and basalt. Long after the fire went out, that massive stone heart would radiate a gentle, life-saving heat for 24 to 36 hours. By August, Arturo finally framed the house. But even this was done backward in the eyes of the town. He didn't just build a house, he built a tightly sealed, heavily insulated shell around the stone monolith. The stove was the absolute center of the home. The staircase wrapped around it. The master bedroom shared its back wall. When October rolled in with its first biting frost, the locals had officially dubbed the cabin Pendleton's Tomb. The jokes were endless. Kids on Halloween dared each other to run up and touch the giant gravestone inside Arturo's window. Through it all, Arturo remained polite, distant, and focused. He stacked 5 cords of seasoned oak in his woodshed. "You know, Arturo," Deputy Chief Tom Lewis said one afternoon, while Arturo was buying extra matches at the hardware store, "if things get bad this winter, you can always head down to the community center. We have dual commercial generators. Don't let pride be the death of you." "I appreciate the concern, Tom," Arturo replied, packing his supplies. "But I think I'll be just fine." They laughed. They all laughed. Right until the second week of January, when the sky fell. Winter had been deceptively mild, fueling Oak Ridge's collective ego. By New Year's Day, there had barely been a foot of snow. People were complacent. But high in the stratosphere, thousands of miles above the Arctic Circle, a phenomenon known as sudden stratospheric warming was violently tearing the polar vortex apart. The jet stream, the invisible atmospheric wall that keeps Arctic air trapped at the pole, shattered. On January 12th, the anomaly plunged straight down the spine of the continent, dead centering on the Pacific Northwest. Meteorologists didn't even have a color code for the radar maps. It was a weather event meant for a different epoch. It began on a Tuesday afternoon. At 1:00 p.m., it was a brisk 28 degrees Fahrenheit. By 3:00 p.m., the wind changed. It didn't just blow. It howled with a low metallic shriek that rattled the double-pane windows of every house in Oak Ridge. Inside his cabin, Arturo was reading a book when he noticed the sudden, eerie silence of the local birds. He walked to his window. A wall of blinding, slate-gray clouds was devouring the mountainside. The temperature gauge outside his window began to drop so fast he could actually see the needle moving. By 5:00 p.m., it was 0 degrees. By 8:00 p.m., it was -20. By midnight, the thermometer bottomed out at -45 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills pushing past -70. The town of Oak Ridge was not built for -45. Physics began to assert its brutal, unforgiving dominance over modern convenience. At 1:15 a.m., the sheer weight of ice and the snapping of brittle, frozen pine trees decimated the power lines. The entire grid went dark in a cascading grid failure that spanned 3 counties. But Oak Ridge was a tough town, right? They had backups. Greg Miller woke up in his custom-built 4,000-square-foot home to the sound of silence. The power was out. Unfazed, he waited for the automated click of his $40,000 standby diesel generator. The click came, followed by a grinding, agonizing whine. And then, nothing. At -45, the diesel fuel in his outdoor tank had gelled into a useless, waxy sludge. His engine was choked. Down the road, Sarah Jenkins turned up her thermostat, relying on her massive underground propane tank. But propane obeys the laws of thermodynamics. At -44 degrees, propane ceases to vaporize. It remains a liquid. It will not boil into the gas needed to fuel a furnace. Across Oak Ridge, pilot lights flickered and died. Furnaces went silent. Panic, cold and sharp as glass, began to slice through the town. Inside their homes, the temperature plummeted at terrifying speeds. Water pipes didn't just freeze, they exploded, spraying water that instantly turned to ice on the living room floors. In the dark, people bundled in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air of their own bedrooms. The roads were utterly impassable, buried under 3 feet of flash-frozen snow that felt like concrete. Cars wouldn't start. Batteries were drained of their voltage by the extreme cold, and engine oil had thickened to the consistency of tar. They were trapped. Up on the wind-battered eastern slope, the epicenter of the storm's fury. Arturo Pendleton's cabin stood in total darkness. The wind screamed against the siding, trying to rip the roof off. But inside, it was a different world. At 6:00 p.m., anticipating the drop, Arturo had loaded a carefully measured stack of dry oak into the firebox of his massive masonry heater. He opened the air vents wide and struck a single match. Because of the incredible draft created by the extreme temperature differential, the fire roared to life with the intensity of a jet engine. The flames burned at nearly 1,800 degrees, a clean, ferocious burn that produced almost no smoke. For 2 hours, Arturo let the fire rage, watching the heavy iron door of the firebox glow faintly. The superheated exhaust gases didn't go straight up the chimney. They were forced down and around through the labyrinth of channels inside the 6-ton stone structure. The rock drank the heat. By 8:30 p.m., the fire was nothing but white-hot embers. Arturo shut the heavy iron damper, sealing the system. Now, at 2:00 a.m., while the town of Oak Ridge was freezing in the dark, plunging into survival conditions, Arturo Pendleton sat in his armchair, wearing a light cotton t-shirt. The interior of the cabin was a balmy, bone-warming 74 degrees. The 6 tons of soapstone and basalt had become a massive thermal battery. It stood in the center of the dark cabin, radiating a profound, gentle heat in all directions. It was a physical presence in the room, like a living, breathing creature, keeping the lethal cold at bay. Arturo placed his hand flat against the warm stone, feeling the steady, thrumming pulse of trapped energy. He poured himself a cup of coffee from a percolator, resting on the stove's heated ledge. Down in the valley, the situation was degrading from an emergency to a catastrophe. At the community center, Deputy Tom Lewis was frantically trying to get the commercial generators running. But they had made a fatal flaw in the town's emergency planning. The generators ran on natural gas lines, and a critical regulator valve down the mountain had frozen solid and cracked. The emergency shelter was completely dead. The temperature inside the gymnasium was already in the single digits and falling. People were starting to realize that nobody was coming for them. The state highways were blocked. The plows were frozen to the pavement, and helicopters couldn't fly in the blinding, shearing winds. By dawn, The pale, anemic sun rose over a town locked in a death grip. Houses were coated in thick rime ice. Inside those houses, the elderly were becoming unresponsive. Families huddled in single beds, desperately trying to share body heat, weeping as frost formed on the inside of their windows. Greg Miller, wrapped in 2 sleeping bags, watched his breath freeze in his custom living room. His cell phone was dead. His family was crying. The interior temperature of his multi-million-dollar home was 12 degrees. He knew, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that if they stayed in this house for another night, they would not wake up. He needed to find heat, real heat. And then, peering through a scraped-off patch of ice on his window, he looked up toward the eastern slope. Through the howling whiteout conditions, standing resolute against the apocalyptic freeze, there was a faint, steady ripple of heat waves rising from a single chimney. Pendleton's tomb. Greg swallowed hard, his throat raw from the freezing air. The man he had mocked, the man the whole town had laughed at, was the only one on the mountain who was still warm. The laughter was gone. Now, it was just a desperate, primal instinct to survive. Greg kicked off his sleeping bags and started putting on his boots. Greg Miller didn't bother packing bags. There was no time, and the extra weight would only kill them faster. He turned to his wife, Diane, whose lips were already carrying a faint, terrifying shade of blue. She was holding their 7-year-old son, Leo, tightly under a pile of down comforters. "Get up," Greg ordered, his voice cracking. "Put on every layer of wool you have. Gore-Tex on the outside. We are leaving." Diane stared at him, her eyes wide with panic. "Greg, it's -40 outside. The truck is dead. We won't make it to the community center." "We aren't going to the center," Greg said, strapping on his heavy insulated pack boots. "We're going up the ridge, to Pendleton's." Diane thought he had lost his mind, but the conviction in Greg's eyes left no room for debate. 5 minutes later, they stepped out of their front door. The cold did not feel like weather. It felt like a physical assault. The air was so dense and frigid that drawing a breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. Moisture from their eyes froze instantly, welding their lashes together. The distance from the Miller estate to Arturo's cabin was barely a mile, an easy 15-minute uphill hike in the summer. Today, it was a death march. The snow was thigh-deep and crusted with a fragile layer of ice that broke under their weight, trapping their legs. Greg took the lead, using his body like a battering ram to break a trail, while Diane followed close behind, dragging Leo by the arm. Halfway up the ridge, the wind hit them. It was a sustained, shrieking 40-mile-per-hour gale that dropped the wind chill to a lethal -75. Leo stopped walking. He just collapsed into the snow, the insidious warmth of hypothermia trickling into his brain. "No, no, no, Leo, stand up!" Diane screamed, her voice instantly swallowed by the roaring wind. Greg lunged backward, grabbing his son by the collar of his parka, hauling him up. "Walk! You have to walk!" he roared, but the boy's eyes were rolling back. Panic, primal and blinding, seized Greg. He hoisted the heavy child over his shoulder, ignoring the burning agony in his own lungs, and pushed upward. Through the blinding white out, a shape emerged. It wasn't the fragile outline of a timber frame. It was a fortress, Arturo's cabin. Smoke was curling lazily from the heavy masonry chimney, instantly whipped away by the wind. Greg practically fell against the heavy oak door, pounding on it with his frozen, numb fists. "Arturo! Arturo, please! Open the door!" The deadbolt snapped back. The door swung open, and Arturo stood there, wearing a flannel shirt and corduroy pants. Before Arturo could even speak, Greg shoved past him, collapsing onto the hardwood floor of the entryway with Leo. Diane fell to her knees beside them, sobbing hysterically. Then the realization hit them. The air. It wasn't just warm. It was thick, radiant, and heavy with heat. It felt like stepping onto a tropical beach. The ambient temperature in the cabin was 72 degrees. Arturo didn't gloat. He didn't ask questions. He immediately knelt, helping Greg strip the frozen, ice-caked outer layers off his son. "Get him to the stone," Arturo commanded softly. "Don't put him too close to the firebox. Just lean his back against the soapstone bench." Greg carried his shivering son to the massive monolith in the center of the room. The 6-ton Russian stove was radiating heat like a captured sun. As Greg laid his hand against the smooth, dark rock, he broke down. The town's toughest contractor leaned his forehead against the warm stone and wept uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," Greg choked out, his shoulders heaving. "Arturo, I'm so sorry. I was a fool." Arturo walked over, handing Greg a steaming mug of black tea. "The cold doesn't care about our Greg. Drink this. Your boy is going to be fine." Down in the valley, Deputy Tom Lewis was making a similar, desperate calculation. The community center was failing fast. The indoor temperature had dropped to 8 degrees. The elderly were starting to slip into unresponsiveness. The natural gas lines were dead, the electrical grid was non-existent, and Tom's radio was completely silent. Tom had one asset left, a 1980s mechanical diesel Snowcat that the county used for grooming ski trails. It had no computerized fuel injection, no sensitive electronic sensors to fail in the extreme cold, and a block heater that Tom had managed to keep running with a portable propane torch. It roared to life in a cloud of thick black soot. Tom gathered the 15 most vulnerable people in the shelter, including Sarah Jenkins, the town clerk, and Dave Hodges, the hardware store owner. He packed them into the back of the treaded vehicle like sardines. "Where are we going?" Sarah chattered, her teeth clicking violently. "We're going to the tomb," Tom said grimly, shifting the heavy treads into gear. An hour later, Arturo heard the heavy mechanical grinding of the Snowcat tracks over the roar of the wind. He opened his door to see the bright yellow machine idling in his yard. Tom Lewis stumbled out, waving frantically. For the next 20 minutes, Arturo's quiet sanctuary transformed. 19 people, half frozen, terrified, and exhausted, piled into the cabin. The temperature inside immediately plummeted from the open door and the sheer mass of freezing clothing. But the stone battery held. The massive block of soapstone pushed back against the cold, its thousands of pounds of thermal mass effortlessly absorbing the sudden temperature drop. Within an hour, coats were unzipped. Within 2 hours, people were stripping down to their base layers, sitting in a wide circle around the giant stone monument. Sarah Jenkins stared at the massive rock, then up at Arturo, who was quietly brewing a massive pot of coffee on the stove's upper ledge. "Arturo." "How?" she whispered. "Thermal mass, Sarah," Arturo said gently. "Modern houses are built like thermos bottles. If you don't have a constant flow of hot energy going into them, they get cold. I built a battery. I charged it with a fire yesterday, and it's discharging that heat slowly into the room. It will keep us alive. But the true test was yet to come. By Thursday morning, the storm had not broken. The wind had shifted, bringing a relentless, wet, heavy atmospheric pressure that sat on the valley like a concrete lid. The cabin was crowded, smelling of wet wool, coffee, and anxious sweat. 19 people were consuming the oxygen in the tightly sealed home, and the thermal mass of the stone was finally beginning to cool. Its surface temperature had dropped from a toasty 180 degrees to a lukewarm 90 degrees. It was time to fire the stove again. Arturo carefully stacked 40 pounds of seasoned oak into the deep firebox. The crowd watched him with reverent silence, treating the process like a sacred ritual. They knew their lives depended entirely on this one piece of primitive engineering. Arturo lit a twist of newspaper and held it up into the draft channel. But instead of the flames being sucked violently upward, as they usually were, the smoke wavered, hit an invisible wall, and billowed backward into the living room. Arturo choked, waving the smoke away. He tried again. The smoke poured out thicker, filling the cabin with an acrid haze. "What's wrong?" Greg asked, stepping forward, his contractor instincts kicking in. Arturo's face was pale. The chimney cap, the freezing fog and the extreme wind, it's caused rime ice to form a solid plug over the spark arrestor on the roof. The chimney is choked. If I light this fire, it won't draft. We'll fill the cabin with carbon monoxide and suffocate if I don't light it. He touched the cooling stone. We freeze by midnight. Panic rippled through the room. "I'll go up," Greg said immediately. "I'm 20 years younger than you, Arturo. I roofed this town. I can do it." "The roof is a sheet of black ice, Greg," Arturo warned, "and the wind will blow you right off the edge." "Tie me off," Greg replied, unblinking. They worked fast, using climbing rope. Arturo had in his gear closet. They fashioned a crude harness around Greg's waist. Arturo tied the other end to the heavy timber newel post of the staircase. Greg bundled back into his frozen gear, grabbed an 8-pound sledgehammer, and Arturo opened the front door. The cold was waiting. It rushed in like a predator, dropping the room's temperature by 10 degrees in seconds. Greg pushed through, out onto the porch, and began his ascent. I used a ladder Arturo had stashed under the deck. Every rung was coated in thick ice. The wind tore at him, trying to pry his frozen mittens off the aluminum. When he crested the roofline, the gale hit him square in the chest, knocking him flat against the asphalt shingles. He low-crawled, sliding perilously close to the edge, saved only by the sudden tension of the rope held taut by Arturo inside. Inch by inch, Greg fought his way to the top of the massive stone chimney. Arturo was right. A dome of solid, opaque white ice had completely encapsulated the metal cap. Greg braced his boots against the masonry, raised the sledgehammer, and brought it down. Crack! The ice didn't yield. He swung again, harder, screaming against the wind. Smash! A massive chunk of the ice dome shattered away. Immediately, a rush of warm, stale air blasted out of the chimney pipe, hitting Greg in the face. The airway was clear. He slid back down the roof, practically falling onto the deck, and lunged back inside, slamming the heavy door behind him. He collapsed on the floor, gasping, shaking violently, but grinning. "Light it," Greg wheezed. Arturo struck a match. He tossed it into the firebox. This time, the extreme cold outside and the clear chimney created a massive vacuum. The fire caught with a deep, echoing whoosh. It sounded like a jet turbine spinning up. The intense, 1,800-degree secondary combustion ignited, burning bright white. The crowd of 19 people cheered, a collective sound of pure, unadulterated relief. For 2 hours, they watched the fire roar. Then Arturo shut the dampers. The stone had drank its fill. The battery was charged. The temperature in the room steadily climbed back to a glorious 75 degrees. They rode out the rest of the storm in comfort. By Friday morning, the horrific winds finally died. The clouds broke, revealing a blinding, painful blue sky. The temperature was still a deadly -20, but the atmospheric anomaly was over. At noon, they heard the distinct rhythmic chopping of rotor blades. 3 Oregon National Guard Black Hawk helicopters crested Miller's Ridge. They had been flying over Oak Ridge for an hour, finding nothing but dead, frozen houses, anticipating a mass casualty event. Then, the lead pilot spotted the singular column of heat waves rippling from Arturo's chimney, and the bright yellow snowcat parked outside. When the rescue crews kicked their way through the snowdrifts and opened the cabin door, they were stunned. They expected frozen bodies. Instead, they found 20 people sitting comfortably in T-shirts, drinking the last of Arturo's coffee, surrounded by 6 tons of heavily engineered stone. The evacuation took hours. As they loaded into the Black Hawks, the townspeople of Oak Ridge looked back at the cabin. Nobody was laughing now. The massive stone chimney stood against the white landscape, unmoving, triumphant. Months later, when spring finally thawed the mountain, Oak Ridge began to rebuild. Plumbers made fortunes replacing burst pipes. But the biggest change was in Greg Miller's construction business. He refused to build standard fireplaces ever again. Instead, his crew traveled to specialized courses, learning the ancient, rigorous mathematics of refractory brick and thermal mass. Arturo Pendleton remained exactly as he was, quiet, methodical, and perfectly content. But he never bought coffee at Wanda's Cafe again. Every morning, without fail, a fresh cup was waiting on his table, paid for in advance by the very people who had once called him a fool, forever grateful to the man who built a monument of stone to save a town of glass. When modern systems fail, ancient wisdom, combined with brilliant engineering, becomes the ultimate lifesaver. Arturo's 6-ton stone stove wasn't just a heater. It was a testament to the power of thermal mass and the danger of our reliance on fragile grids. If you loved this gripping, true-to-life survival story of human resilience, hit that like button, share it with your friends to spread the knowledge, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible tales of survival.